Ethan Walker had everything the world could possibly offer a man. Everything except peace. At 38 years old, he was the youngest billionaire in the country, the founder of Walker Innovations, a global tech empire that powered half the devices people used daily. His name was synonymous with brilliance, ruthless strategy, and iron discipline. The magazines adored him. His sharp jawline and piercing gray eyes graced covers monthly. Headlines like "The Ice King of Silicon Valley" or "The Man Who Can't Lose" followed him wherever he went. Investors worshipped him, competitors feared him, and politicians courted his favor. Yet, for all his fame and fortune, Ethan carried an aura of loneliness that few dared to acknowledge. Every morning began the same. At precisely 5 a.m., his alarm chimed with a low hum, and he rose from his king-sized bed in his glass-walled penthouse overlooking the city skyline. The apartment, though stunning, was silent and sterile, decorated in sharp lines and monochrome shades. No photos hung on the walls, no children's toys cluttered the corners. No sign of warmth touched the polished marble floors. His routine was flawless. A workout with his personal trainer, a perfectly balanced breakfast prepared by a chef he rarely spoke to, and then hours buried in meetings, strategies, and contracts. To the outside world, this discipline was admirable proof of his unstoppable success. But to Ethan, it was simply distraction, a way to keep his mind from wandering into places he refused to revisit. Because beneath the armor of his success lay a man who once knew love, and who once lost it. The shadow of Clara. Her name haunted him like a ghost. Clara Hayes. She had been his college sweetheart, his first true love. Clara had been everything he was not, warm where he was cold, patient where he was restless, soft where he was unyielding. She had taught him how to laugh without caution, how to see beauty in simple things, how to imagine a future that wasn't built on ambition alone. For years, they were inseparable. She supported him when he worked late nights as a broke dreamer coding in his tiny apartment. She believed in him when no one else did. Together, they had whispered about marriage, children, a house with a garden where they could watch their little ones play. But dreams withered under the weight of obsession. As Ethan's startup began to grow, his hunger for success consumed him. Nights at home became rarer, phone calls unanswered, promises broken. Clara tried to reach him, begged him not to lose himself in the chase for wealth. But Ethan had convinced himself that everything he was doing, every sleepless night, every missed anniversary, was for them. By the time he realized she didn't care about riches, that she only wanted him, it was too late. A bitter argument ended with tears on her cheeks and silence between them that stretched for years. Clara walked away, and Ethan, too proud to chase after her, let her go. That single decision carved a hollow space in him that no amount of money could fill. The reputation. In the years that followed, Ethan hardened. He built walls of steel around his heart and drowned himself in work. To the world, he became untouchable. Journalists described him as emotionless. His employees whispered that he was a machine. He wore the mask so well that even he began to believe it. Women entered his life, but none stayed. Some were drawn by his wealth, others by his reputation, but Ethan never let them close. He knew intimacy meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain. Better to remain cold, controlled, unreachable. The irony was bitter. He had everything people dreamed of: private jets, sprawling estates, a company worth billions, but he had never felt emptier. He could silence boardrooms with a single glance, yet the silence of his own home crushed him more than any rival could. The nightly ritual. There was one ritual he never spoke of. Every night, after the city lights flickered on and the penthouse grew quiet, Ethan poured himself a glass of whiskey and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows. The skyline glittered like a sea of stars, but he saw none of its beauty. Instead, his mind wandered back to Clara. Did she ever think of him? Was she married now, with children? Was there another man who made her laugh the way he once did? Sometimes he imagined bumping into her on the street, her hand in another man's, a child running at her side. The thought pierced him deeper than any business loss ever had. Because in all his empires, in all his victories, He had lost the one treasure he couldn't buy back. Despite the emptiness gnawing at him, Ethan excelled at the performance of power. He wore tailored suits that fit like armor, spoke in clipped sentences that carried weight, and made decisions that shaped industries. At galas, he was the star everyone wanted to orbit, yet he left alone every time. At charity events, he wrote checks with too many zeros, but his eyes never softened at the cause they served. The press speculated endlessly about his private life. Some said he was secretly married, others claimed he was incapable of love. Ethan neither confirmed nor denied. He let the myth swirl because the truth, that he was still in love with the woman he let slip away, was too fragile to expose. The warning signs, but cracks had begun to form in the armor. His doctor had warned him of stress. His assistant noticed his late-night pacing. His board whispered about his short temper. Ethan ignored them all. Work was his refuge, the one place where control remained in his hands. What no one saw, however, was how the loneliness grew heavier with each passing year. In the quiet hours of the night, when he could no longer drown himself in numbers and strategies, the weight of what he had lost pressed on his chest like an anchor. He was a billionaire, yes, but he was also a man suffocating in silence, haunted by the memory of a love he had destroyed with his own hands, foreshadowing the fall. And so, Ethan Walker lived on as the world's coldest billionaire, admired, feared, envied. But deep down, his empire stood on fragile foundations. Because no empire built on denial can stand forever. Fate, unpredictable and merciless, was waiting for him. It would not come in the form of a hostile takeover, a financial crash, or a scandal in the press. No, it would come in the form of a chance encounter, a moment in a hospital corridor, where the ghost of his past would return not as memory, but as reality. Clara. And beside her, two fragile lives he never knew existed. The day began like any other for Ethan Walker, though his schedule was packed tighter than usual. He had agreed, reluctantly, to appear at St. Mary's Medical Center for a charity signing ceremony. His company had pledged a staggering donation to fund advanced research equipment, a gesture meant as much for public relations as for genuine contribution. Ethan himself had little interest in ceremonies. He believed his money should do the talking. Still, his board insisted he make a personal appearance. By late afternoon, the hospital bustled with anticipation. Reporters gathered outside, cameras flashing whenever Ethan's convoy of sleek black cars pulled up to the entrance. Dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his presence commanded silence as he stepped out, flanked by his assistant and two security men. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and something more human. Fear, hope, desperation. The polished corridors echoed with hurried footsteps of nurses and the faint beeping of machines from behind closed doors. Ethan walked through it all with the same practiced indifference he carried into boardrooms. He shook hands with hospital administrators, posed for photographs, and gave a short, clipped speech about innovation and the future of medicine. Applause followed, but it washed over him like background noise. In truth, he was already thinking about his next meeting. And then it happened. The glimpse through glass. As his assistant guided him toward the exit, Ethan's stride faltered. A movement caught his eye, a figure sitting alone in a small, dimly lit hospital room. Something in him twisted, a pull he couldn't ignore. He slowed, ignoring the impatient glance from his assistant. Through the narrow glass window he saw her, Clara. For a moment, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, that fatigue had conjured her out of memory. But no. There she was, her hair a little darker, her frame thinner, her shoulders hunched with exhaustion. The sight hit him like a blow to the chest. Years melted away in an instant, and the carefully built walls around his heart cracked. She wasn't alone. Two small beds stood side by side, each holding a child so fragile that Ethan's breath caught. They were hooked up to machines, thin tubes snaking around their little arms, monitors flashing weak vital signs. The children, twins, he realized in stunned disbelief, looked heartbreakingly frail, their chests rising and falling with shallow breaths. Clara sat between them, holding their tiny hands, whispering something he couldn't hear. Her face glistened with tears, her lips trembling as she forced a smile for them. The sight rooted Ethan to the spot. The bustling hospital around him faded into silence. The billionaire who never froze, never faltered, stood paralyzed before the window, his pulse hammering in his ears. The war inside him. 1,000 thoughts collided in Ethan's mind. Why was Clara here? Who were those children? Why did the sight of them stir a feeling so raw, so terrifyingly tender, that he could barely breathe? Logic, his old ally, tried to take control. They couldn't be his. They must be someone else's. Clara had moved on, built a life without him. Of course she had. He was the one who let her go. And yet, something deeper, instinctive, whispered otherwise. The shape of their faces, the faint curve of their chins, even the way the boy's tiny fist clenched as though fighting an invisible battle, it all struck chords of recognition within him. Could it be? The idea that these children might be his hit Ethan harder than any corporate defeat ever could. A hollowness opened inside him, one that wealth had never been able to fill, now demanding answers. The first step. His assistant tugged at his sleeve. "Mr. Walker, the car is waiting." "We should." But Ethan didn't move. His gaze was locked on Clara. She looked so tired, so heartbreakingly human. Her once bright eyes dulled by nights without sleep. He had known her laughter, her strength, her light. Seeing her like this ignited a storm of guilt he wasn't prepared for. Before he could stop himself, Ethan pushed open the door. The room fell silent. Clara's head snapped up. For a moment, disbelief flashed across her face. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Her hands instinctively tightened around the children's. "Ethan," she whispered at last, the name carrying both shock and old wounds. He stepped inside, though every fiber of him screamed to retreat. The sterile air pressed down on him, heavy with the beeping machines and the faint rasp of the twins' breathing. Up close, the children looked even more fragile. Pale skin, sunken eyes, tubes that seemed far too large for their tiny bodies. Ethan's throat tightened as a realization struck. These weren't just sick children. These were dying children. The questions unasked. His voice, usually sharp and commanding, faltered. "Clara, what's going on?" She stared at him, her eyes burning with a mix of emotions. Anger, sorrow, fear. But she said nothing. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the twins, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead with trembling fingers. Ethan's chest constricted. He wanted to demand answers, to insist she tell him everything. But the words lodged in his throat. For the first time in years, he felt utterly powerless. He moved closer, each step heavy as lead. "Clara, are they yours?" The question sounded absurd even as it left his lips, but he couldn't stop himself. Clara's silence stretched like a blade between them, and then, in that silence, he saw it, the resemblance. The boy's jawline, the girl's gray-flecked eyes. They weren't just hers. They were his. The truth crashed over him with merciless force. The breaking of a mask. Ethan staggered back, his carefully constructed mask of composure shattering. His mind reeled. His children, his flesh and blood, had been suffering, fighting for life, and he hadn't even known they existed. How could Clara have kept this from him? But even as the thought rose, so did another, quieter, sharper truth. He hadn't been there to know. He had chosen ambition over love, power over family. He had walked away when Clara needed him most. Clara's eyes finally met his, filled with tears and fury. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly, her voice shaking. "Not now." Her words pierced deeper than any accusation. Ethan wanted to speak, to explain, to beg, but his tongue felt heavy. Instead, he looked at the twins, his twins, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Not of losing money, not of losing status, but of losing them before he ever had the chance to hold them as his own. The storm rising. Outside the hospital room, the world continued as always. Nurses hurried past. Announcements crackled over intercoms. Cars honked in the streets beyond. But inside, Ethan's world had changed forever. He stood frozen, caught between the man he had been and the father he had just discovered he was. Every deal, every dollar, every victory in his empire suddenly seemed meaningless compared to the fragile lives lying before him. For the first time in his life, Ethan Walker, the cold billionaire, didn't know what to do. But one truth was already carved deep in his heart. He could not walk away again. The silence in the hospital room was suffocating. Machines beeped faintly in the background, each sound a reminder of how fragile life could be. Ethan Walker stood like a statue, his powerful frame awkwardly towering near the door, while Clara sat hunched between the two small beds, her hands protectively curled around her children's fingers. She looked at him with eyes that held a storm. Years of pain, disappointment, and unspoken words burned there. Ethan, the man who had commanded boardrooms, silenced senators, and negotiated billion-dollar deals with a calm smile, suddenly found himself unable to speak. But his heart screamed. The question that shattered him. Finally, his voice cracked the silence, low and uneven. Clara? Whose children are they? He hated himself for asking, because even as the words left his lips, the answer was already written across their little faces. Their eyes carried flecks of gray identical to his own. Their jawlines hinted at his. Even the girl's stubborn little chin looked like a mirror of him as a child. Clara's jaw tightened. Her hand stroked the boy's forehead gently, her touch filled with a tenderness that twisted the knife deeper in Ethan's chest. "You shouldn't be here, Ethan," she whispered, not looking at him. "You don't belong in this room." His throat tightened. "Don't belong? Clara, if they're mine." His voice broke, raw with something he hadn't felt in years, pleading. "If they're mine, then I have every right to be here." Finally, Clara looked up. Her eyes were red, swollen from tears, but her gaze was sharp enough to cut through steel. "You had your chance to be here, Ethan, years ago, but you made your choice." Her words dragged him back to memories he had buried under layers of work and pride. Nights when she waited for him with dinner gone cold. Birthdays he missed, anniversaries forgotten. The way she had once cried and begged him to slow down, to just be with her, and how he brushed it off, convinced that success would fix everything. But success had fixed nothing. It had cost him everything. Clara's voice was steady now, though each word carried the weight of years. "They're yours, Ethan. The twins. Noah and Grace." She glanced down at them, her expression softening for an instant before hardening again. "They're 5 years old, and they've been fighting since the day they were born." Ethan's knees nearly gave way. 5 years. He had been a father for 5 years, and he hadn't known. While he was celebrating billion-dollar mergers, his children had been fighting for their lives. While he was traveling the world in private jets, Clara was sitting alone in hospital rooms like this, holding their hands through pain he couldn't imagine. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was hoarse, desperate. "Clara, I had a right to know." She shook her head, her face etched with bitterness. "A right? You forfeited your rights the day you chose your empire over me. I begged you, Ethan. I begged you to see me, to see us. But you didn't. And when I found out I was pregnant, I knew you wouldn't have time for them either. I wasn't going to beg you to love your own children." Her words landed like blows. Ethan's chest heaved as the reality sank in. She hadn't kept the twins from him out of malice. She had done it because she had lost faith in him, because he had given her every reason to believe he would fail them. Ethan ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, now disheveled under the weight of the moment. For once in his life, he had no strategy, no plan, no carefully prepared words. He felt stripped bare. His gaze drifted back to the twins. Noah's little chest rose and fell weakly under the oxygen tubes, while Grace's tiny hand twitched faintly against Clara's palm. They looked so small, so breakable. Ethan's heart clenched with a fierce protectiveness he didn't understand. All his life, he had believed love was a distraction, a weakness that slowed men down. But looking at them, he realized the truth. This was no weakness. This was power. The raw, terrifying power of love that demanded everything and gave no guarantees. "I didn't know," he whispered, the words tumbling out as if they could erase the years of absence. "Clara, I swear, I didn't know." Clara's eyes glistened with tears, but her expression remained cold. "And what would you have done if you had known, Ethan? Cancelled one meeting? Missed one flight? Do you really think you could have been the father they needed?" The truth hung between them like a guillotine. Ethan had no answer. He didn't know if he could have been that man 5 years ago. All he knew was that he needed to be that man now. The weight of guilt. He moved closer, standing at the edge of the children's beds, his presence looming but uncertain. His hand hovered, trembling, as if reaching out to touch his daughter's hair, but fear stopped him. Did he even have the right to touch them? Clara saw the hesitation. For a fleeting moment, her heart softened. She remembered the Ethan she had once loved, the one who had whispered dreams into her ear under starlit skies, who had made her feel like she was the center of his universe. For a heartbeat, she saw that man flicker in his eyes. But then she remembered the nights alone, the unanswered calls, the silence when she needed him most. Her jaw hardened again. "They don't know you," she said quietly. "You're a stranger to them, and I won't let them be hurt by you the way I was." Ethan's breath caught. A stranger. To his own children. The word cut deeper than any insult, deeper than any loss. "I don't want to hurt them," he said, his voice breaking. "Clara, please, just let me try." The cracks in her armor. Clara shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks despite her resolve. "Trying now won't erase the years you missed. It won't erase the nights they cried in pain, the surgeries, the endless fear. You weren't here." Her words were meant to push him away, but inside, a small part of her wavered. Because as much as she wanted to hate him, as much as she had trained herself to live without him, she could see the truth in his eyes. He was broken. Not because of his empire, not because of his failures in business, but because for the first time in his life something mattered more than all of it. And that something was lying in these beds. The turning point. The room was heavy with emotions unspoken, memories unburied, and futures uncertain. Ethan stood silently, every breath ragged, his gaze fixed on Noah and Grace. He wanted to fight, to demand his place in their lives, but he knew this was not a battle he could win with power or money. For the first time, he would have to earn something the hard way. Finally, he whispered, his voice raw, "Tell me what I can do. Please, I'll do anything. Just don't shut me out of their lives. Not again." Clara looked at him for a long moment, her heart a battlefield between anger and the faintest flicker of hope. She didn't answer. Not yet. But for Ethan, the fact that she hadn't said no was enough. It was the smallest of cracks in the walls she had built. And through that crack, he vowed, he would pour every ounce of love, regret, and determination he had left. The days that followed blurred into one long, sleepless stretch of time. For Ethan Walker, life had always been measured in calendars, appointments, and deals sealed before deadlines. But inside the walls of St. Mary's Medical Center, time bent differently. Hours bled into hours, marked only by the rhythm of machines and the fragile rise and fall of his children's breaths. He did not leave. At first, the hospital staff assumed he would. They had seen wealthy donors before, men and women who made grand entrances, posed for photographs with sick children, and then disappeared in black cars, their perfume of money lingering in the air long after they were gone. But Ethan did not leave. He dismissed his assistant, canceled meetings, and turned his phone off. A thing no one in his company believed he was capable of doing. When his assistant protested, Ethan's reply was simple, his voice quiet but absolute. "Nothing matters more than this." The billionaire in the waiting room. The sight of Ethan Walker sitting in a cramped hospital waiting room quickly became a curiosity. Nurses whispered behind their masks. Orderlies stole glances. The man who commanded skyscrapers now sat in plastic chairs under fluorescent lights. His suit traded for rumpled shirts and undone ties. At night, when Clara drifted into exhausted sleep at the children's bedsides, Ethan remained awake. He paced the hallways, speaking with doctors, calling in specialists from around the country, using every ounce of influence his name carried. Private jets delivered new machines, experimental medications, top-tier pediatric surgeons, all at his command. But when he returned to the room, when he stood over the beds of Noah and Grace, he realized that no amount of money could guarantee what he wanted most: their lives. The awkward father. At first, he did not know how to be around them. He stood stiffly at their sides, hands awkward in his pockets, unsure if touching them would somehow break them. But slowly he began to try. One night, a nurse encouraged him to hold Grace's hand. Tentatively, he reached out, his large palm enveloping her tiny fingers. She stirred, her eyelids fluttering open for a brief second, her gaze unfocused but curious. And in that instant, Ethan felt something collapse inside him. The fortress he had built around his heart crumbled at the touch of her fragile hand. He began reading to them, stumbling over the simple words of children's books he ordered in stacks. His deep voice, more accustomed to boardroom commands, softened into a gentle rhythm. At first, Clara watched with suspicion, her arms crossed. But as nights turned into weeks, she saw the sincerity etched into his tired eyes. One evening, as he read a story about a brave rabbit to Noah, the boy's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. Ethan's chest ached so fiercely with joy, he nearly broke down beside the bed. The shift in Clara. Clara resisted him, at least in the beginning. She had lived 5 years without his presence, had learned to armor herself against disappointment. Watching him now, hovering beside their children, calling doctors at midnight, whispering promises under his breath. Part of her wanted to believe him. Another part whispered that it was too late. Yet she couldn't ignore the change. The Ethan she had known before, the one she left behind, had been consumed by ambition, blind to everything but his empire. The man before her now sat for hours holding a small cup of water to Grace's lips, his tie forgotten, his hair disheveled, his hand trembling as though this simple act mattered more than any fortune. One night, Clara found him asleep in a chair beside Noah's bed, his head resting against the railing, his hand still clutching his son's. Tears pricked her eyes. For the first time, she wondered if perhaps he truly had changed. Conversations in the dark. Late at night, when the children finally rested, the room would fall into a rare silence. In those moments, Ethan and Clara spoke. At first, the words were brittle, weighed with anger and regret. "You left me," Clara said one night, her voice low but sharp. "I know," Ethan whispered, staring at the floor. "And it's the biggest mistake I've ever made." She looked at him skeptically. "You think a few weeks here will erase 5 years of absence?" "No," he admitted. "But maybe it can prove that I don't want to be absent anymore." Their talks stretched into the small hours. Ethan confessed things he had never admitted. Not to his board, not to his so-called friends, not even to himself. He told her about the nights he had stared at the city skyline, wondering if she was happy somewhere without him. He told her how success had felt hollow, how his victories tasted like ash when celebrated alone. Clara listened, her heart warring with itself. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to protect herself from being hurt again. Both desires coiled inside her, pulling her in opposite directions. The billionaire's helplessness. For all his money, Ethan learned the bitter truth of helplessness. There were nights when the children's fevers spiked, when alarms shrieked, when doctors rushed in. He stood back, powerless, his fists clenched, his heart pounding so loud he thought it might burst. Each time he prayed. A man who had never believed in prayer before. He whispered desperate bargains into the sterile air. "Take my wealth, my empire, everything I own. Just let them live." Clara saw him break down once. Alone in the corridor, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with sobs. She almost turned away, unwilling to see him like that. But something in her chest softened. This was not the Ethan she had known before. This was a man stripped raw, humbled by love and fear. The small victories. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, Noah and Grace began to improve. Their cheeks gained a hint of color. Their tiny voices grew stronger. Grace giggled weakly at one of Ethan's clumsy attempts to tell a joke, and Noah clutched at his father's sleeve when he read his favorite story. Each small victory felt monumental. Ethan celebrated them quietly, his eyes shining with relief. Clara caught him once, wiping a tear quickly when he thought no one was watching. She began to see him not as the ruthless billionaire, but as the father of her children. The man who sat for hours teaching Noah how to hold a crayon, who braided Grace's doll's hair with all the seriousness of a corporate deal, who whispered goodnight prayers he barely knew how to say. Yet, despite everything, walls still stood between Ethan and Clara. She could not forget the years she had fought alone, the bitterness of being abandoned. And he could not forgive himself easily. Guilt hung over him like a shadow, a constant reminder of all he had missed. One night, after Grace finally fell asleep, Ethan turned to Clara, his voice quiet, broken. "I don't deserve them," he said. "Or you. But I want to try. I want to spend the rest of my life making up for what I've lost." Clara looked at him, her heart aching with the weight of both past and present. "You can't erase the past, Ethan." "I know," he whispered. "But maybe I can build a future." Over time, the staff stopped whispering about the billionaire in the children's ward. To them, he was no longer the icy tycoon from the magazines. He was the father who fetched blankets at midnight, the man who read bedtime stories until his voice cracked, the one who fell asleep beside his children's beds night after night. And slowly, painfully, Clara began to see it too. The empire he had built still existed, towering and untouchable. But inside these walls, none of that mattered. Ethan Walker was not a billionaire here. He was simply a man, broken, repentant, learning how to love again in the dim glow of hospital lights. The morning light in St. Mary's felt different that day. It streamed through the narrow windows, not in the pale gray tones of endless hospital nights, but in warm gold, casting long shadows across the room. Clara noticed it first, stirring awake in her chair by Grace's bed. For weeks, she had grown used to waking in darkness, startled by alarms, trembling at every cough and restless movement. But this morning was calm, peaceful. When she turned her head, she saw Ethan still sitting upright in his chair, his tie loose, his face unshaven. He hadn't slept. His eyes were fixed on Noah, who was smiling faintly in his sleep. "Something's different," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse. Ethan glanced at her and then back to the children. "They're breathing easier," he said softly, almost reverently. "You can hear it. The doctors were right. The worst is over." It was true. The beeping machines that had once screamed danger now hummed steadily, more like guardians than threats. Noah's cheeks, once pale as porcelain, carried a flush of color. Grace's tiny hand twitched in her sleep, clinging to her blanket with strength she hadn't shown before. For the first time since the nightmare began, hope entered the room like sunlight through open blinds. The celebration of small miracles. Later that morning, the doctors confirmed it. The treatments had worked. The children's bodies, fragile as glass only weeks ago, had fought back against the darkness. The road ahead was long, months of recovery, checkups, therapy. But they would live. Clara broke down when she heard the words. Tears flowed freely, her body shaking with relief. She pressed her forehead against Grace's bed rail, whispering prayers of gratitude. Ethan turned away at first, his jaw trembling, ashamed of how undone he felt. But then Clara reached for his hand. She didn't say a word, didn't need to. The simple touch shattered whatever pride he had left. He held onto her as if she were the only thing keeping him upright. For days afterward, the mood in the ward shifted. Nurses greeted the family with wide smiles. Doctors stopped by with extra words of encouragement. Even the other parents, who had once cast curious glances at the billionaire in their midst, now nodded at him with quiet respect. He had become part of the ward's rhythm, one of them no longer above or apart. Fatherhood in motion. As Noah and Grace grew stronger, Ethan began to step fully into his role as their father. He fed them spoonfuls of soup, guided their hands as they colored in sketchbooks, and learned the lyrics to lullabies Clara had sung alone for years. His voice was deep and slightly off-key, but it didn't matter. The children clung to it like a lifeline. One afternoon, Noah asked him, "Daddy, will you stay?" The question silenced the room. Clara froze, her heart thundering. Ethan swallowed hard, kneeling beside his son's bed. "I will," he said. "For the rest of my life I'll stay." The promise wasn't dramatic, not shouted from boardrooms or plastered across headlines. It was whispered, spoken only to the little boy who had never known him before. But in that moment, it carried more weight than all the empires he had ever built. Clara struggled with her own heart, watching Ethan soften, watching him prove himself day after day, made her ache with something she had buried long ago. She remembered the man she had fallen in love with years earlier, the man who had laughed with her under cheap streetlights before wealth and ambition hardened him. And yet, the wounds of abandonment still lingered. Could she really trust him again? One evening, as the children slept, she stepped outside onto the hospital balcony. Ethan followed, his coat draped loosely over his shoulders. "You've changed," she admitted quietly. "But how do I know you won't change back?" Ethan didn't hesitate. His voice was steady, but his eyes glistened. "Because I've seen what I almost lost. Money, power, they're nothing. If I go back to who I was, I'll lose you. I'll lose them, and I can't survive that." Clara searched his face, looking for cracks in his resolve. But all she saw was truth, worn raw by sleepless nights and love rediscovered. A family reborn. The day finally came when Noah and Grace were strong enough to leave the hospital. Nurses gathered by the door, clapping softly as the family prepared to go home. Clara held Grace's hand. Ethan carried Noah in his arms. For once, the billionaire didn't look like a man of wealth and power. He looked like a father, tired, grateful, and profoundly human. Outside, the city buzzed as always. Cars honked, people rushed past, skyscrapers stretched into the sky. But for Ethan, the world had slowed. Every step he took with Clara beside him and his children safe in his arms felt like walking into a new life. At home, he didn't retreat to his office. Instead, he built pillow forts in the living room, cooked clumsy breakfasts, and told bedtime stories until his children drifted into dreams. Clara watched him, day by day, her heart softening. The walls between them didn't vanish overnight, but brick by brick, they crumbled. One night, weeks after returning home, Ethan and Clara sat together on the balcony of her small apartment. The children were asleep inside, their soft laughter lingering in the air. "I've been thinking," Ethan began carefully, "about us, about the future." Clara tilted her head, cautious. "What about it?" "I don't expect forgiveness all at once," he said. "But I want to be here, not just for them, for you. I want us to be a family again, if you'll let me." Clara's eyes filled with tears. For years, she had raised her children believing they had no father. For years, she had built a fortress around her heart to survive the loneliness. Now, that fortress was crumbling under the weight of a man who had finally learned what love meant. She reached across the small table, her fingers finding his. "One day at a time, Ethan," she whispered. He nodded, relief washing over his face. One day at a time. A new dawn. Months later, the twins ran across the park, their laughter filling the air. Ethan chased after them, his once-tailored suits replaced by simple jeans and sneakers. Clara watched from a distance, smiling as Noah climbed onto his father's shoulders and Grace tugged at his hand. The man who had once been defined by boardrooms and billion-dollar deals had found something far greater. Not redemption through power, but through love. Not success measured in profits, but in the giggles of his children and the quiet smile of the woman he had almost lost forever. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the park in golden light. Ethan lifted his children high into the air, their laughter echoing like music. Clara joined them, her hand slipping into his, no longer hesitant but sure. For the first time in years, Ethan Walker felt whole. The billionaire was gone. In his place stood a father, a partner, a man reborn. And as the new dawn spread across their lives, one truth became clear. Love had saved them all.